Hello. So welcome to the webinar for week 4 of Econsec101x. Hi, I'm Tyler Moore. You will have seen my face on the other slides from this week in videos. So I guess the purpose of this webinar is really just to try to answer some questions that you have. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to proceed through the questions that were raised in the discussion section, pontificate a bit about those, and then in the meantime, if you have questions and you're watching this live, please post questions in the Q&A feature of the Hangout. I'll start to answer those whenever the time comes. Let me make sure that let me just do a quick double check of my audio to make sure it's going to come through okay. Okay, let's see. So I think that might be a little bit better. Okay, so all right. So the first question that I got in here, private companies doing product evaluations. So what's your opinion on private companies like Forrester and Gartner doing product evaluations? And what's their incentive to do a realistic evaluation? And most importantly, have their past evaluations been correct? So this is an excellent question. We have things like the Magic Quadrant and the Gartner Wave and all these industry products that you can subscribe to that will sort of tell you about which products they think are better or worse than others. And so I know that many companies use this to try to decide, when you're choosing between products. And so first of all, do we know if these evaluations have been correct? So there haven't been any academic or even industry studies that I'm aware of that really answer that question. But from an incentive perspective, I think that they have a strong incentive to be as accurate as they can be, because they're essentially taking they're being paid by companies who are prospective customers to these vendors, and so they certainly have a reason to give a valuable assessment, because if they give bad recommendations consistently, companies might give up on using them. So there is an incentive there. Now, whether or not they would be willing to give a fully honest opinion, that's maybe a different question, because they do also have relationships to maintain with the vendors. But the thing that I will say is that it's definitely the case that these industry evaluations are signaling devices that are trying to deal with this information asymmetry that exists and plagues many of you who are in industry. One of the big problems you face, which is you're trying to buy a product or a service, say a DLP service, and you have lots of vendors who you can choose from, and it's really hard to determine, which one has the better product. And so from what I can see, these Gartner and Forrester reports help winnow the field somewhat, so that you can at least get some initial winnowing to a set of contenders, and then it's still up to the company to do its own due diligence in terms of choosing between them, because making sure that you have the right features that you need, and also maybe even doing some kind of testing to make sure that it seems to work as it's projected to. But as with all signaling devices, it's going to be imperfect. And sometimes the signal is going to be great, and sometimes it's not. And so you may or may not get what you'd like out of it. But that's just the nature of the signaling devices. Sometimes they really help, and there's definitely information that's being conveyed there, but it's certainly imperfect. So one of the things I would say here is, for those of you who are in the class, I'd like to turn this around to you and maybe put this back in the discussion. Can you reply to this post and weigh in with your experience in the Forrester and Gartner products for have they been useful to you whenever you whenever you use the information? Did it actually yield a product or service that you were satisfied with? or did it not? And so we can sort of take an informal poll from that to see how often it's been helpful, how often it's sort of been bad information, and maybe we can answer the question empirically that way. Okay, so good. We already have our first question from the Q&A. I'll go ahead and reply to that one now, since to try to encourage more participation and reward those who are actually here. So Konstantinos asks, could you comment on the analogy combination regarding information asymmetry in the market of preventive security measures with information asymmetry inside an organization? Right. So information asymmetries really are everywhere. We just had this discussion about trying to, the information asymmetry that exists in trying to identify a particular product. But within an organization, there are still going to be some information asymmetries, in that the people that you're working with, some are going to be more qualified than others. And so when you take the perspective of a new employee within an organization, effective employees have to spend some time learning and coming up with their judgments about which employees can do what and how the overall organization works. And so there's definitely rampant information asymmetries there. So within the specific example, security managers trying to justify some new software product management, it's very likely the case that the manager knows more about the particular product that he's going to be recommending, right? And more about security, for that matter. So he's going to have access to better information than his manager does. But there are ways sort of around that, and that the manager needs to do his best to establish credibility, or the security manager should establish credibility by conveying to his upper management that I've made recommendations in the past and they've worked out well, and sort of establishing a positive reputation can really go a long ways towards mitigating the information asymmetries that exist. So, I mean, you're never going to be in a situation where you would expect the manager to understand the same level of detail that the security specialist would. But it's the job of a good manager to be able to communicate information to higher up in the chain, and get them to make the decisions that they need to. And the best way to really ensure that is through reputation and repeated interactions. And this is one reason why it's good to have a lack of turnover in a firm, and that if you have people who have had to make a series of decisions, and if it works the first time, then the next time they're more likely to give you the benefit of the doubt. And so that's one of the best ways to deal with this inherent asymmetry of information. Okay, so keep the questions coming on the Q&A. In the meantime, I'll move on down. So Alexander Rockel asked a question about regulation, what works and what doesn't. So if we assume there's going to be a consensus at some point in time that regulation is required, what kind of regulation do we want to have? Liability rules, certification requirements, transparency. Should it only impact service providers in given sectors? Well, I mean, I think the one thing we know about cybersecurity is that it is a very pervasive issue across many sectors, and there really is no one size fits all. So I don't think we're ever going to see a single type of regulation to rule them all. I think that transparency rules, the information disclosure, I think is useful. We've already seen that it's been useful, and in the context of data breach, I think it can be used in other areas. We also see disclosure requirements in the context of healthcare, for instance. In the U.S. at least, there's HIPAA and high tech, which are legislation that essentially requires disclosure of breaches of personal information. But within healthcare, you also have prescriptive ex ante safety regulation, particularly as it relates to privacy. So there's the HIPAA regulations, which essentially require a certain level of care of private information that's collected. So I think the way we'll typically see this shake out is more industries that are already more highly regulated are more likely to see regulations in cyber, whereas industries that are less regulated are going to be probably less likely to see these regulations initially. So we can already see this playing out. For example, in the electricity generation industry, there already has been a number of regulations that have come into play through in the US something called NERC, the National Energy Reliability Council. So they have requirements to disclose sabotage attempts. They have a number of baseline security and safety investment requirements. So within that highly regulated industry, there's already been a push to do some kinds of regulation, although often in a self-regulatory fashion. So within financial industry is another example of a highly regulated industry that already has attracted interest from regulators, right? So certainly banks are inspected by bank regulators and auditors, and these auditors ask questions about the overall risk that the company is facing, and they have already realized that cyber risk is something that they have to consider. There are sort of reputational risk challenges there, and there's all sorts of potential correlated risks. So, yeah, so I think we're already seeing it in finance and in healthcare. Things like social media and technology is historically been very lightly regulated, and I think that's going to continue. But what I think is most likely to happen is we will have this sort of different experimentation across sectors and across jurisdictions, and we're going to see sort of a shakeout among what has worked and what hasn't worked. When regulations get tried and are successful, they get copied. You can just look at data breach disclosure for that. California was the one state that passed this data breach disclosure requirement. Now it's in 47 U.S. states. It's in other countries as well. And so successful policy interventions end up being copied and replicated, whereas less successful ones likely will just sort of fall away. Okay, so let's see. So Amy Juso, sorry I've mispronounced that name. Oh, I think I select this question. Okay, so you have to bear with me on this Google Hangout interface. This is the first Q&A I've done on this, so sorry. So I didn't select the first question, but now I'm selecting this one. So information asymmetries versus imperfect information. Are critical companies consciously free riding, or are they typically just unaware of the impacts of the decisions they make? Well, I think it's a bit of both. Yeah, I think it's a bit of both. And free riding, typically comes in the context of public goods, which may not necessarily be an issue with information asymmetry. So if with a public good, you may have perfect information, but it's a public good, and so companies could choose to free ride. I think with information asymmetries, I think that what we see is that companies may not be aware that there's an asymmetry in place. They may just not know that they have good enough information. But even if they do, they're not necessarily in a great position to do anything about it. So you have to make decisions based upon the world you live in, right? And so firms will make their security investment decisions. They have to choose a type of security technology that they're going to deploy, and they just make the best go of it that they can. They may know that they don't have very good information, but they're going to just do steps that they can to overcome that as best they will. I'm not typically of the view that this is, in something that enters the overt intentions of a particular company, that they know there is an information asymmetry and they're going to exploit it. Some companies may do that, but as a general rule, I think it's just a recognition of the challenges of the economy that we face. Okay, so I'll ask it. John Lynn has asked a good question. So, are you aware of any significant examples of non-compliance with disclosure regulations and/or cases involving disclosure failures? Okay, so yeah, well, here's the deal. I've definitely heard lots of reports and claims from industry, people in different jurisdictions saying that there are lots of breaches that happen that go unreported. But I haven't seen any documentation, systematic documentation of that happening. So, in theory, it makes sense that there would be non-compliance with the disclosure regulations, because in many of the laws there is no penalty for non-compliance. Okay, so yeah, so if you a firm doesn't disclose that they've suffered a breach, then then the regulators find out. The only thing that has really happened is regulators have then said, hey, you really need to tell us. One thing that I will say is in the context of the SEC, so the Security and Exchange Commission in the United States has begun requiring publicly traded companies to disclose information on cybersecurity risks and experiences and their public filings. And there are several examples of companies who did not disclose that they did not disclose to the SEC that they had experienced some sort of cyber risk or cyber event, but then something subsequently came out in the news. And when it came out in the news, the SEC actually wrote in a public letter to these companies saying, we looked at your recent filings, you talk nothing about cyber risks that you've experienced, and yet we know from these public sources that it has. Can you please talk about it and do better? So I think regulators are watching, but they're essentially, operating with their hands tied behind their back, because they don't necessarily have the authority or the resources to investigate this kind of activity of non-disclosure. And furthermore, the law is often written in a way that there's no penalties for non-disclosure. So it certainly seems possible. I've heard anecdotes, but I'm not convinced that it is a systemic problem. Okay, so I'm going to, bear with me for a second. I'm going to select this question, which we already talked about at the beginning, and say done. And I'm going to select that one and say done, just to sort of clear my dashboard of questions. Okay, so Richard Koresh, I'm not sure how I pronounce that, says that there's pressure in the US for legislation to encourage sharing of threat and incident information. What's needed for such legislation? What's the liability that companies are concerned about? So that's a very good question, and I want to link that in to a question that came up from the discussion board posted by James Davis. So James Davis said, in some areas of the world, the internet industry is highly skeptical of attempts at cybersecurity regulation due to some bad blood. As soon as a past history of badly conceived and confusing legislation or constant attempts to push an agenda of state surveillance and censorship. So do you think there's effort needed to regain trust between governments and service providers? So I think that post is very closely tied to the question that Richard asked, there is definitely a push in the US for information sharing legislation. There was an attempt in 2012 to essentially require this kind of sharing that ultimately failed. The Obama administration has since put in voluntary mechanisms in place that they're trying to get buy-in for. In fact, President Obama is, I believe, in California today giving a speech on this very issue. But essentially, that's an attempt to go around legislation and just get more voluntary cooperation. But the broader issue here is pointed out with this question of trust or lack of trust that exists over this. So, part of the part of the reason there's a lack of trust is because there have been lots of examples of reason to be distrustful. So in the U.S. we had this debate a couple years ago on SOPA and PIPA, which were attempts to enshrine the ability in law for copyright holders to request the removal of complete websites from search engines and from other service providers based upon their persistent support of copyright violations. And this is basically an attempt to extend what exists in the DMCA, its notice and takedown regime, but was designed just for particular URLs on a website, and to extend that to entire websites. Yeah, so that was highly controversial. Wikipedia turned its website off for a day. I mean, basically, there was a lot of pushback from internet companies on that, and that is one example of how companies started to see that there is this overreach by the government in trying to meddle with the internet. Then, of course, there's all the things that have come out from the Snowden revelations, which has really poisoned the well for Silicon Valley companies, because these companies are very dependent on the trust of consumers, because they're reliant on consumers giving all of their personal data to the companies. And so if it turns out that the government is accessing a lot of that information without authorization, that's going to undermine their business model, and it's going to freak citizens out, which it seems to have done. So there's often a reasonable concern to try to link together concerns over privacy and surveillance with security measures. Yeah, so much of the information sharing that is being called for is purely for sharing, cybersecurity threat information, and that, on its face, should seem very different for when compared to sharing information on surveillance for terrorists. But at the same time, the way it's been presented, there's no clear demarcation necessarily between cybersecurity incident information and surveillance information. So yeah, I think that there's a very healthy skepticism of some of these laws. The one thing that I will say is that, because this gets to the question about what is the need for such legislation. I'm not ready to say that there is no need for this legislation. I think that information sharing could be useful, and there are some concerns among the industry that if they were to share information, that this could open them up to liability claims, and so they're kind of hoping to link a liability exemption as sort of a carrot to participate in the sharing. And I think there's a case could be made for that. But I'll just say that there is tons of information sharing on cybersecurity threats that already happens without this legislation and is happening within the private sector. And so you see lots of the responses to botnets and trying to take down botnets, trying to share information on computers that are infected in botnets. This is all this information passes and is carried out by the private sector and sort of works. So there's definitely a thriving cybersecurity information sharing regime that already exists without legislation. And so the open question is how to design this in a way that doesn't screw up what's already happening, because what's happening actually is working somewhat. Okay. Let me just see here. Okay, so let's go to a question from the discussion post. Okay, so I've answered that one. So there's a question about from Alexander Rockel. I think he asked another question about effectiveness of current certification schemes. So the question is, are you aware of any research on the effectiveness of popular certification schemes? He points to the common criteria, ISO 27K. Do they reach their goals? So, I mean, in the video I gave some examples of challenges with things like common criteria. They can be circumvented if you have if you enable the vendor to do some shopping around for the certification organization. So I mean, there are real concerns there. You know, I don't want to undermine all certification schemes just because of an example where it didn't work. There are cases in which it definitely seems to work, and it definitely seems to help compared to nothing. So I guess this really gets back to a point that I raised in the answer to the first question, which is that these signaling devices are always going to be imperfect. Every signaling device is imperfect. When you think about even traditional non-cyber ones. So one example that you would learn about in an economics class for a signaling device is a university degree. So one of the reasons companies try to hire people from universities is that by obtaining that degree, they get a signal of the quality of that person, the quality of education that person has received. It's a combination of achieving the degree and the reputation of the university that conferred the degree. And that seems reasonable, but we all know that, you know, there are, you know, brilliant people who never even got a degree from any university. And we also know that there are people who went to Harvard who weren't very smart in the first place, right? So I guess I can say that because I used to work there. But the thing we know is that the university degree is a signal that conveys information. More often than not, it's informative, but sometimes it's not going to work perfectly. And so we can't expect perfection out of things like the common criteria or the website security seals. I think what we need is we need to have some conviction that they're more informative than not having them in the first place. And I haven't seen empirical studies to demonstrate the common criteria has been useful, but I do know that within organizations that have used it for a long time, like the military, they do view it as, on the whole, a positive thing. Yeah. Okay. So let's see what else I have next here. One more question from. Okay, actually, there's a question here from N. Weber on shoring up certification seals. So I think this is a follow-on here. It was stated that certification seals used by various websites are often abused by bad operators. So this example used in the lecture of a seal that appears to be a simple image on a website. You're wondering if there are advancements beyond the use of simple images. So yeah, so here's the deal. Most of the seals that you can get now are images, but they're often images that you can click on, and you click on the image, and it will take you to the website for the seal operator, and you can see that it's actually up to date and verified and all that. And then the seals will also sometimes say the date that when the update occurred, and this is designed to prevent people from just taking screenshots of other seals and then reusing them. And so the issue here is not being able to convey the legitimacy of the seal with something besides an image. The issue is that criminals have found out that they can just copy the image itself and use that on the website, and people will believe it, even if they haven't even registered for the seal. So the challenge is a bit like what we saw with phishing websites. So in theory, computer scientists might have thought that phishing wouldn't be a problem because all banks have SSL certificates, and so people should know that if there's no SSL certificate, then it can't be a legitimate bank. But what the criminals realized is that most people don't know anything about SSL certificates. So they just created copies of the website that didn't have their certificates at all. And some people still fell for it. So the challenge that these websites seals have is that you can come up with a fancier verification mechanism than a simple image. But it turns out that if you just want to copy a seal, you can just copy the image, and some people are going to believe that because they don't necessarily know what the proper way is to verify the legitimacy of the seal. So that's just a persistent challenge that's going to exist with these seals. Okay. So let's look here. So Jari Pirhonen asks a good question. So most regulations and standards emphasize the need for risk management. Well, there's even a risk management standard, right? However, risk analysis is difficult because of a lack of historical data and because people being poor in estimating threats and especially probabilities. So what's my take on risk management? Well, my take is that you're right. Risk management is hard to do well in cyber because of the reasons you laid out. I think this is an example of the information asymmetries and lack of accurate information that takes place. So I think that we're still in a world where most firms try to hide behind incidents when they occur, and this in turn makes it much harder to adopt a risk management based approach where you're actually estimating probabilities of incidents. It's further complicated by the fact that we're dealing with adaptive adversaries, and so it's not like a natural phenomenon where we can reliably use just statistical models to find what the distribution of events is and go from there. We have an adversary that adapts to the defensive mechanisms that we take place and to new technologies when they come across. So risk management in terms of empirically estimating risk and their probabilities and their impact is going to be hard. The fact that it's hard doesn't necessarily mean that I'm willing to give up on it, though. Some people do, but I still think it's ultimately the way forward. I think the current state is a sign of the immaturity of cybersecurity as a scientific discipline, but I guess I'm optimistic in that I think that it can still be improved as we go forward. I think that it's hard to estimate probabilities, but it can be done. People have done this for data breaches. People have done this for things like card fraud losses, for a range of things. We can do estimates of probabilities. The other thing is estimating loss amounts, and estimating loss amounts is also hard. It's hard for a couple of reasons. One, because people don't want to talk about their losses, but two, because many of the losses that you're concerned about are indirect losses and things that are inherently hard to quantify, things like reputational damage and this sort of thing. So it can be very hard to use an off-the-shelf risk management model where risk equals cost times likelihood. You can use that to give you some guidance, but it's going to be an imperfect solution. So let's talk about Delian's question. Lots of good questions coming this way, guys. I really appreciate it. So you explained the importance of transparency and data breach disclosure on one hand, and the reluctance of players to disclose such data on the other, just as we've discussed. Are there ideas or anonymization mechanisms about making this more effective? Well, I think that there are certain things that can definitely be done. I think that anonymization may help, but it's not necessarily even a technical anonymization that's required. So if we go back to the last example I gave in the third lecture for this week, talking about the Dutch ISP market, there we had some information that was being shared about infection levels at large ISPs, but it was not disclosed publicly. It was disclosed in a way that it was just benchmarked, so that the each ISP knows, where it stands relative to others, but it doesn't know what the names of the other companies. And so benchmarking like that has been shown to be effective in various contexts, not just in that one Dutch study. I think anytime you have a relatively small number of players, and you have this variation where there are a few sort of bad apples who are doing worse than the rest, this type of benchmarking can be useful, provided that the impetus within the organization is to try to do better. There are contexts in which some companies really don't care. There are some web hosting providers, for example, who aren't interested in doing a great job on security. They just want to do a good enough job to where they're not going to get shut down by the police or anything. So in those contexts, it may be a little harder just to do benchmarking. You may need to actually do some public revelation. But I think that it's certainly possible to keep this somewhat information that's been aggregated somewhat private. And the other example where we've seen this is the information sharing and analysis centers, or ISACs, that exist in the US, but also elsewhere now. These are sector-specific organizations that share cyber threat information. The most successful example is the Financial Services ISAC. That organization is sort of a private arrangement where there are member organizations, and they voluntarily contribute information to that organization, and it's only shared within the organization. So that type of arrangement can be successful, provided that there is an interest in the industry to deal with whatever the risks are. And so I think it's telling that the FS ISAC, the Financial Services ISAC, has been far and away been the most successful of the ISACs. So the way the arrangement was initially set up is that there would be a sector-specific ISAC for all critical infrastructure sectors, things like transportation, water, electricity, power generation, and they've had varying degrees of success. And when you look at it, the organizations that have been most successful have a strong incentive to want to share this information. Financial services has a clear reason to try to want to share information with their competitors about threats, because they're trying to reduce financial fraud, and they see value in it. Other sectors whose threats are mainly externalities, where if there's an attack that targets them, it's going to affect others more than them, they're likely to be a little bit less enthusiastic for sharing. And so in those contexts, we may need to actually have a bit stiffer hand in forcing the sharing. Okay. So we have a question here from Albert, who's saying, is it possible really to make a cybersecurity defense using only a regulatory compliance such as HIPAA, the NIST cybersecurity framework, or something else? And well, it is possible to make a defense. Whether it's an effective one, I'm not so sure. I think even the proponents of things like the NIST cybersecurity framework, they view this as a floor and not a ceiling. So what I mean by that is that the goal of a compliance regime is really to establish baseline minimum standards for performance. And so when done well, these compliance regimes can sort of raise the overall performance of sort of the laggards. But the risk of some of these compliance regimes is that they end up becoming a race to the bottom. And so companies that maybe previously would have done different things differently use their limited security budgets to meet compliance obligations. And so you can end up with actually a less secure outcome for some of them. I think that compliance-driven security is never going to be a complete solution. It's useful in the context where you have these interdependencies and across sectors, and you want to make sure that there is no outlier who is doing so much worse than the rest that can cause harm on the other aspects, other firms in the industry. So compliance regimes have a role there, but it's not going to be a one-all be-all solution to cybersecurity. In any company whose cybersecurity practices are entirely compliance driven and that's all they care about is likely to not be doing as good a job as they should be. Okay. Oops, I guess I forgot to select that one. So there's the question. If you're just coming to it, you can go back and see the rest of my answer. Okay, so follow-on question from Ami on the Dutch ISP case study I mentioned. How could that be turned from a one-time study to constant practice so that ISPs would always know where they stand? Well, I mean, it depends. So there are industry organizations which try to share some of this information, but you know, so there are things like Shadow Server, which is constantly monitoring botnets, and companies can subscribe to these different feeds of information, and they can learn about their own position from there, and that goes on among the better companies. But the problem is that the ones who aren't doing as well may not actually see this information. I think what's ultimately required is you need some kind of outside impartial body to step in to do some of these measurements. In the case of the Dutch study, it was researchers at TU Delft, but I think it could be researchers. It could actually be the government. It could be a government organization like US CERT or the DHS or the ANISA in Europe could take a role that they're going to start collecting relevant cybersecurity indicators collected on a longitudinal basis and share that with industry sectors. And I think that could be a very viable solution. There's no reason that it has to necessarily be the government, but I think it does need to be an outside party. It could be a private organization or a nonprofit like at a university who does it, but it could also be coming from a government organization. Yeah. Oh, I screwed up and I didn't click on that in time. Okay, so let's see. So following on from that, there was a question that Rowson24 posted, said Threat Exchange, Facebook. So any thoughts on the private sector creating their own information sharing forums like Facebook's Threat Exchange? So yes, I do think that the private sector could take the lead in collecting information on threats. And they currently are in a lot of ways, because you have organizations that are collecting. And Facebook Threat Exchange is one example. The Anti-Phishing Working Group collects phishing information. They also have something called the E-Crime Exchange, where they're trying to collect general cybercrime data. Organizations like Stop Badware have a data sharing program where they get contributions on web-based malware reports. So Shadow Server, I already mentioned them. There's a myriad private organizations who are studying different parts of the elephant. But what's lacking is an organization that can take a wider view of the whole and see the sum from the whole of the parts. So the whole from some of the parts, and that's going to require, I think, possibly someone like a government institution, or at least a nonprofit that's been well budgeted to do so. Yeah. Okay. Let's see. Have I covered that one? That one. Just checking all the discussion posts. Yeah. Okay. Sharing. So I didn't explicitly answer this question from Bosman about in the U.S. has there been any effort in information sharing among financial industry sector, but I did refer to that earlier. The FS ISAC is the best example. of that? And is there any evidence that sharing could reduce potential breaches? I think the best example that I can think of FS ISAC is a few years ago. So it's a few years ago, criminals started really targeting spear phishing emails sent to payroll departments and accounts payable within small to medium businesses, and then using that to get account information and transferring out hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars from those accounts to accounts held by criminals. So that started happening, and then the FSISAC started talking about it and disseminated widely this information, and got a response across the financial sector quite rapidly within a few months of that starting. And so there's a much greater awareness of that threat. Now that threat still continues to this day, but participants in the FSISAC now are aware of it and are actually trying to take steps to mitigate it. So yeah, I think that there are examples where it has worked well. Okay, so I think I've covered all the questions on the discussion board. Right now, there is one question left on the live Q&A. So this gets back to the risk management question. This is from Albert. So in risk management, I know the hardest part is how to describe cost of assets. What's the better way to do it for estimating the costs with the owners of assets or by alone using IT? Okay, so I mean, I'm not so sure that's the hardest part. I think they're all pretty hard. I think the costs of your assets, the costs of an attack, and the costs of the probability of an attack are all pretty substantial. So this is a little hard to do because it kind of depends heavily on the organization having insight into how it values things. And so I think organizations can do an okay job of figuring out, if what certain assets of theirs, what they're valued at, and what a loss of those assets would mean. I think that it may be hard for the IT staff to know that, but certainly within other aspects of the company that should be available. And it's probably easier for larger companies and for public companies who have to explicitly track this kind of information. But yeah, I think it's just something that you have to find the right people in the company who can help you with that. Okay, so I believe I've gone through all the questions. I guess sort of speak now or forever hold your peace. If you have any final questions you want to ask, now's the time to ask them. But barring that, I think this has been a very fruitful discussion. I hope you're all enjoying the course. I've certainly enjoyed being able to develop some content for it, and good luck in the future. I'll see you later.